Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our Indy. This is Captain April, and these are the days of our Indy.
Okay, we're going to try this again here. I don't know what happened last time. The computer just trying to pick that moment to lock up on me. I had to complete reboot. Hard reboot as it leaned on the power switch. Okay, so we're going to start this over again because I deleted the other one. All right, so Indy, so you don't have to do all this reading. Just get yourself a nice hot beverage, curl up there in the chair, and just watch and listen. Yeah, this is from a clinical psychologist, 30 years in the field. It pretty much breaks down the whole thing of why gender dysphoria is a lie. And with a gender ideology and all that crap that goes with it. Okay, from the top. Psychological distress and aberrant behavior. It builds a case of why we are where we are and how we got here. Psychological distress and aberrant behaviors are always conceptualized through the lens of culture, and in any society at any given time that we create medical and psychological narratives to best understand aspects of human behavior based on these prevailing norms. Then these go on to shape further behaviors. This is known as the symptom pool. Anorexia was almost unknown in Hong Kong until a public awareness campaign was launched by Western psychiatrists in the 1990s. Within a few years, there was a 2,500% increase in cases. Girls diagnosed with anorexia were treated sympathetically. They were taken out of school and given positive reinforcement for their illness. Unsurprisingly, more girls began restricting their eating, thus causing a growing feedback loop of youngsters developing anorexia. The awareness campaign in Hong Kong had in effect created and spread a novel mental illness and its behavioral sequelae into a population of receptive and suggestible adolescents. In the 1980s and 90s, false memory syndrome led to families being torn apart by accusations of supposed childhood sexual abuse, particularly incest, though through guided imagery, hypnosis, and simple suggestion, psychologists encourage clients, mainly women, to recover entirely facetious memories of sexual abuse, some supposedly occurring as early as 3 months old. After the 2004 Sri Lanka tsunami, the unknown concept of PTSD was introduced in the general population by well-meaning foreign aid agencies. They never heard of it, and then suddenly, I am. It's, In the 2000s, Japan saw a surge in the incidence of depression after GlaxoSmithKline released the antidepressant Paxil into the local market. Even further back, the infamous case of the symptom pool in operation is Salem, Massachusetts, in the late 1600s, where mainly teenage girls, sounds familiar, fell into the mass delusion that they were being pricked and attacked or possessed by the devil. Adults ran with this idea. As more girls received positive attention and sympathy by showing symptoms of possession, the contagion spread. The rest, they say, is history. Currently, the West is in the grip of an unprecedented medical scandal arising from a new entrant to the symptom pool, namely gender dysphoria. Here's why, from the perspective of being a nearly 30-year qualified clinical psychologist, I believe that gender dysphoria is a false construct, one that has caused, and if not stopped, will continue to cause immeasurable harm to innumerable numbers of people. The addition of gender dysphoria to the symptom pool is fed by the concept of gender identity, an unprovable metaphysical belief that we all have an innate sense of our gender, that our gender exists outside of our physical bodies. Andy, think of it as the two-spirit nonsense used to mock mercilessly. Okay? This is what you bought into. It's another version of the same damn thing. Gender dysphoria occurs when one's gender identity does not match one's sexed body. Following from a diagnosis of gender dysphoria is the near inevitability of gender-affirming care. This involves the highly unethical and entirely experimental use of puberty blockers, synthetic cross-sex hormones, and the surgical mutilation of physically healthy bodies in order to align with one's supposed gender identity. But gender dysphoria itself is not real. It has no clinical or evidentiary basis. It is a false construct created ex nihilo and from nothing, and first published in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, DSM, 5th edition, in October 2013. We psychologists should not be involved in any of it. The core part of a clinical psychologist's skill set is psychometric assessment. Psychometric literally means measuring of the mind. Psychologists can assess and quantify all manner of psychological properties, qualities, and dysfunction occurring in humans. Anxiety, depression, trauma, resilience, suggestibility, marital health, life satisfaction, you name it, we can measure it. We have hefty catalogs of assessment tools, also known as measures and tests, which can only be purchased according to a qualification code, QL, determined by one's level of training. The highest level assessments, such as tests for IQ and memory, can only be bought by someone holding a QL that corresponds to having a doctoral degree in psychology. These measures are designed and created by a process of research by academic psychologists. Each test comes with a manual that describes 1, the process by which it was created, 2, the population on whom it was standardized, 3, contraindications, whom the test should not be applied to, 4, an explanation of its statistical reliability and validity, and 5, case studies showing clinical applications of the test. Most measures also have means by which false and or inconsistent responding can be detected. There's a point to all this. Tests will typically have a numerical baseline below which an individual is deemed asymptomatic, and then a clinical range, usually of mild, moderate, and severe symptomatology. Each manual has scoring tables. These are usually separated by sex and age. So, for example, in an autism screener, the norms for a 16-year-old boy will be different than those for an 8-year-old girl or for an 8-year-old boy. If the wrong set of norms are applied, the result is invalid. Most tests for children have a 1 self-report form completed by the child, 2 a parent form, and 3 a teacher form. Results are collated, compared, and computer programmers can assist in do intra and inter-score comparisons. Thus, a comprehensive picture of the child's functioning is obtained. These measures have a firm statistical and empirical basis. They are not dreamed up out of thin air. A psychologist can use, for example, the CISS, Coping Inventory for Stressful Situations, a scale for measuring coping styles, task, emotion, avoidance, coping, distinguishing. You've probably gone through a lot of these yourself, Indy. I'm sure they have at some point. In the USA and Canada and France or Spain, and they can know, they can apply these to, they are each measuring the same thing. Most tests come in different language versions. They determine baseline functioning, and they can be re-administered over time to assess for change following any clinical intervention. In order to achieve the goals of alleviating stress and improving functioning, psychologists therefore conduct 1, assessments based on testing, interview, and observation, 2, formulation, identifying the clinical issue based on the assessment, 3, intervention, clinical work directly with the client and or client's family system, 4, evaluation, measuring the effectiveness of the intervention, and where necessary, 5, reformulation, changing one's intervention or even evaluation into accommodation to the new information. And I'm going to put the comment section up here because we're getting some feedback here. Okay, random everything from years ago. Decided to look up what happened to her. What the? Channel, man, it's so sad to see. Yeah, let's just put this up here for a minute. What happened to her? Found her channel. Man, it's so sad to see her get captured by these tanky and shit. Many such cases. Hey, I'm on stream. I'm famous. Oh, yeah. Well, for what it's worth. Only 2 people watching with somebody else. Okay, where was I? All right. Okay, here's the meat of it, though. Gender dysphoria is in reality a long con. it is treated as a valid construct only because it appears in the DSM. But the DSM is merely a trade manual for the American Psychiatric Association. It is a revenue-producing commercial publication. In terms of its clinical rigor, the DSM definition of gender dysphoria is analogous to a description of an item being sold in the Screwfix catalog or a used car description in an auto trader. Let's see what we got here. Okay, yeah. Gender dysphoria was created by committee. Some people, nearly all men, with extremely dubious motivations, sat down in a room in 2013 and simply invented its diagnostic properties. There was no application of the scientific method in its conceptualization and categorization. Genevieve Gluck has done a lot of work on this, showing the behind-the-scenes influence of trans activists and castration fetishists in its creation. This lack of any scientific rigor is reflected in the definition of gender dysphoria, which is full of stereotypes and circular reasoning. Okay, here from the thing, a marked incongruence between one's experience / expressed gender and primary and or secondary sex characteristics. In young adolescents, the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. 2, a strong desire to be rid of one's, primary and or secondary sex characteristics because of a marked incongruence with one's experience, expressed gender, or in young adolescents, a desire to prevent the development of the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. I think this goes to Indy saying she would go back in time and give her 10-year-old self puberty blockers to prevent us. I think because she's trying to head off what happened to her as a teenager. It's a strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics of other gender, a strong desire to be of the other gender or some alternative gender, different from one designated gender, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender or some other yada, yada, yada. I cannot count the number of times I read the phrases, gender dysphoria is a real and distressing condition, but being spoken by journalists, commentators, and politicians. Really, I challenge anyone who says this to actually read the DSM-5 definition of gender dysphoria. They will see it as nonsensical. What is marked and or incongruent? What is strong? How is this measured? How are desire and conviction objectively determined? What are the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender? Does this mean girls cry and boys don't? That girls play with dolls and boys climb trees? How are these typical feelings determined and quantified? How can anyone know that what they are feeling belongs to the other gender? What is an alternative gender? What about differences in culture and upbringing? How are these factored into the diagnosis of gender dysphoria? Why do these conditions only apply to gender? Why not race or wealth or class or nationality? Why only this particular social construct? Also, as an aside, in the IQ test of cognitive capability, one of the tasks measuring verbal IQ involves defining increasingly complex words but without using the stimulus word. A demonstrative example is, what is an elephant? The answer cannot be answered by saying an elephant is an elephant. The correct answer would be an elephant is a four-legged mammal from the genus Loxodonta. But the DSM-5 definition of gender is nothing more than an appallingly facile display of crude circular reasoning. It essentially says gender is gender. As Humpty Dumpty once told Alice, it means just what I choose it to mean. Furthermore, gender dysphoria is the only clinical symptom in the DSM-5 whose treatment involves or even requires surgical intervention. Mia Hughes thus rightly describes the gender dysphoria as the most dangerous classification in the DSM-5. Gender dysphoria as a diagnosis also lacks what psychologists call face validity. Namely, is something measuring, in this case describing, what it appears to be describing. How can a 6-year-old with precocious puberty, a 16-year-old autistic boy, a 30-year-old lesbian, and a 50-year-old married autogynephilic man who secretly wears his wife's knickers, who are all different developmental stages and who have quite dissimilar psychosocial experiences, all be suffering from exactly the same clinical condition? This simply lacks credibility. But it also because it also has no clinical basis. Gender dysphoria is in reality whatever a client, usually a child, says it is. Children are coached online, often by adult men, into believing they are transgender. This process is disgustingly and revealingly known as hatching an egg. Let's see, what are we going in the chat here? Oh, thank you. At least that one. Yep, pseudoscience at its worst. Gender dysphoria is the only psychological construct wherein the client essentially diagnoses themselves as you woke up one day and decided you were a boy, and the psychologist said, "Oh yeah, you are," and also determines their own severity, the Humpty Dumpty effect. The therapist is simply expected to affirm the client's false belief. The clinical assessment, intervention, evaluation, and reformulation that occurs with every other psychological condition is not allowed. It is often even illegal. In some countries such as Brazil, Taiwan, Ecuador, Argentina, Germany, New Zealand, and Canada, a therapist attempting to work ethically, i.e. carrying out exploratory psychotherapy, such as simply asking the client why they think they are trans, can lose their practicing license or even be convicted for practicing so-called conversion therapy. The irony is this is exactly what gender affirming care is, conversion therapy. I'll get to that in a minute. And because there is no instrument to measure gender dysphoria, there is no way of assessing whether whatever the client is feeling has reached the clinical threshold, its severity, if and when it has reduced or been alleviated, or even if it exists. And yes, clients can lie or be deluded. This is why any assessment for gender dysphoria, such as it is, ought to be systemic and lengthy process to eliminate and redirect individuals who are confabulating the UK's Gender Recognition Act, or confabulating. The UK's Gender Recognition Act, even though very flawed, may have recognized this by imposing a minimum period of 2 years. And for children, any assessment of gender dysphoria should always involve their family, school, and wider social system. It should never be with the child alone. To illustrate the parallel, not familiar with that word. The parallel, indeed, criminal state of affairs might be parallel. I was contacted by a mother in California whose 16-year-old nonverbal autistic son was diagnosed with gender dysphoria on the strength of a 20-minute text chat with a gender therapist. A fortnight later, he was on estrogen sent to him through the post by a gender clinic. The mother felt that it was inevitable that her son would progress to a penectomy or a cectomy, basically total castration, and vaginoplasty. It appears that when it comes to gender issues, the mental capacity of the client themselves is completely ignored. Quite simply, anyone can get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria by just demanding one. And as just shown, the lie of gender dysphoria is so dangerous because it is a basis upon which the spectacularly ill-named gender-affirming care is based. Once the magical phase of gender dysphoria is intoned, clinicians unthinkingly and due to activist pressure abandon everything they know about the scientific method, child and adult safeguarding, and all professional ethics and curiosity. They almost instantly initiate the process by which sets clients onto a path of irreversible medical harm. But by diagnosing gender dysphoria, psychologists are making what are called misattributions. These occur when a person ascribes a behavior or feeling to the wrong cause. For example, a person experiencing panic may think their physical symptoms, shortness of breath, thudding heart, and dizziness, are signs of a heart attack. Similarly, a person with social anxiety thinks everyone is staring and judging them whenever they leave home. Psychologists teach clients how to spot misattributions and how to modify their thinking and thereby behavioral responses. Yet, by agreeing to affirm gender dysphoria, psychologists are themselves making a huge and catastrophic misattribution and are acting out of fear. We psychologists ought to know better. As a clinical psychologist for nearly 30 years, I have encountered only one child with gender issues. This was a Palestinian boy who was referred to me when I was working in the Middle East. I now believe he may have had a DSD like in like Iman Khalif, and this genetic abnormality is common in that population. It's basically where the nuts don't drop. And there's no, you're still a boy. Just because the stuff hasn't come out yet, it doesn't change the fact. There's some village in Mexico that's like, it's normal. At about 14 or so, then pops out and boom, okay, now you're a boy. All right, where was I? By contrast, in the UK, over decades of clinical practice, I have sat through thousands of National Health Service team referral and case study meetings. Not once, ever, was gender raised as a presenting clinical issue for any adult or for any child. This strongly suggests that gender dysphoria is just a new, false, and incredibly dangerous explanation for psychological distress arising from developmental, psychosocial, and neurobiological conditions that mental health professionals have known about and which we have successfully treated forever. For example, conditions and presentations such autism, learning disabilities, bullying, same-sex attraction, family dysfunction, poor peer relationships, emerging mental illness, personality disorder, not liking one's body and being disturbed by the physical changes of puberty, etc., and also childhood sexual abuse, which sadly is a huge driver for later trans identification among girls. Girls also reaching menarche at increase, I'm guessing that's, starting to menstruate. At increasingly early ages, the psychosocial impact and the stress arising from starting menstruation at, say, 9 or 10 or even younger cannot be overestimated. But now, shockingly and with supreme irresponsibility, anything and everything that is part of the human condition is being subsumed under the umbrella of gender dysphoria. I'm not saying that people who think they have gender dysphoria are not feeling something. Their unhappiness and distress is often real. But this is being ascribed to the wrong cause. A calamitous and ruinous misattribution is being made. Namely, that there is a mismatch between a person's presumed gender identity and their supposedly incongruent physical body. Thus, we are left with the born in the wrong body trope. I posit instead that gender dysphoria belongs in the family of anxiety disorders and should be renamed somaticized anxiety disorder. Psychologists are well able to treat anxiety disorders through talking therapy and behavioral modification. Treatment for this would be no different than standard psychotherapy for depression or anxiety or relationship problems. Interestingly, Mia, we mentioned earlier, thinks autogynephilia should have its own diagnostic category and that gender dysphoria, such as it is, should become a secondary diagnosis to a primary diagnostic category, for example, of autism or depression. Link there. This is an interesting proposition, and I look forward to her expanding upon this. Another clinical psychology colleague, again, link is on there, offers a fascinating psychodynamic explanation for this social contagion, for which the correct proposed intervention is psychotherapy carried out by a suitably qualified person. And a link there. This is what we psychologists should be doing, using our varying clinical perspectives to offer alternative ways to understand and treat a serious and dangerous belief system that is ravaging Western society. We should be studying, discussing, and trying to understand what purports to be gender dysphoria. We should not be blindly affirming it. Yet because of fierce ideology and rabid activism, public misunderstanding, and clinical manipulation by corporate interests, gender dysphoria has managed to carve out a unique place in the therapy realm, a place where standard clinical or psychological rules no longer apply. Nonetheless, despite its infiltration into public consciousness and warping of clinical practice, gender dysphoria is a false construct. It is based on nothing more than an incongruent ideology. This argument is not how this real condition should best be treated. Mother Nature is not suddenly making huge numbers of developmental mistakes. to mainly white Western children, there is no underlying pathology. There should therefore be no hormones, no surgery, and no interfering with the course of normally occurring puberty. The only intervention to treat SAD should be to talk therapy and behavioral modification. Cultures often get things wrong and make up facetious explanations to understand distressing events in the world around them. For example, in my parents' native Guyana, there was a belief in the old hag, a demonic female spirit that attacked and killed new babies. To protect the baby, mothers placed a Bible open at the end of the 23rd Psalm under the cot mattress. They also covered all mirrors, as old hag was thought to enter the house via this route. Now, with better medical knowledge and the understanding of sudden infant death syndrome, people no longer believe in old hag. They instead take evidence-based and effective measures to protect new babies, such as placing them on their backs to sleep with their feet touching the end of the cot and keeping the room temperature low. A similar conceptual misunderstanding is now happening with the catastrophe that is gender-affirming care. Just as did the Caribbean elders of my grandparents' generation, we too have shown ourselves to be susceptible to falling prey to a false belief system. Gender dysphoria is no more real than the recovered memories of people in the 1980s or the girls at Salem whose hysteria resulted in 19 executions, including that of Dorothy Good, who was just 4 years old. Although it is now 400 years after Salem, we, these sophisticated and educated humans that have ever lived are yet again making the same mistakes. We are being swept up in a mass hysteria, which is leading us to carry out life-saving health care on vulnerable children and adults without a shred of empirical evidence. But this so-called life-saving health care is not incidentally iatrogenic, where the harm to the patient caused by the physician actions is incidental to the activities. No, gender-affirming care is actively anti-medical. The goal, not byproduct, of intervention is the removal of healthy tissue and organs and the disruption of a finely balanced endocrine system. Children and adults who are otherwise in good health are being turned into lifelong medical patients. Their bodies are being destroyed and their IQ and higher cognitive functions are being damaged. There's a couple links here to other articles on this. They will be subject to progressive disability, chronic pain, intractable infections, and endless surgical revisions. They will experience early dementia and probable premature death. Everyone will bear the cost of this insanity. There will need to be huge and comprehensive national efforts to care for these people as they age and as their bodies and brains begin to break down under the onslaught of these completely unnecessary and unethical medical interventions. But for now, money is speaking the loudest. Gender-affirming care is the driving force behind a medical market that is growing by 10% annually and which by 2030 will be worth $6.2 billion. And it is fueled by the false premise of gender dysphoria, our modern equivalent of consulting with the devil, old hag, and recovered memories. Gender dysphoria is a venal lie that is causing untold damage to innumerable people. Let us instead reconceptualize gender dysphoria for what it truly is: somaticized anxiety disorder, a novel culture-bound expression of disordered emotional and social functioning. Let clinicians be free to help distressed clients using all of our clinical skills and expertise. Do not tie our hands. Do not criminalize us. When it comes to gender dysphoria, John F. Kennedy's words come to mind. We subject all facts to our prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. We must now exercise thought and exercise opinions. We must dismantle the teetering, cruel, and destructive insanities of gendered identity, gender dysphoria, and gender-affirming care. We must drain gender dysphoria from our symptom pool. Thank you for reading our article and So yeah, this is on my. I have posted a link to this on my site, on my X page. I'll put a link on this down. In fact, let me just pull that back up. Hold on, let me go on. I'll put a link in the description. So you can read along without my mangled pronunciations and cases. But again, it's like I'm streaming because I can't record. Things fucking up. All right. But I was like, why do I keep going on about all this? Yeah. All right. Well, actually, let's get to the chat here. Now, I find it really interesting. So many people started feeling gender dysphoria around 2018. Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's when they started pushing it. And all these things, and Lily Tino and Dylan Mulvaney, they're morons. And then people are like, oh, but they don't feel like they're more. It's like Bill Maher did it a couple of years ago about this whole thing. It's like, okay, maybe, but, if it's endemic, then why is it regional? Why are, there's so many, so many of these trans kids showing up in California, but not in Youngstown, Ohio. Like either Ohio is suppressing them or California is creating them. Yeah. And let's see, that's the thing. The backlash is we're not taking them seriously. They're like they're jokes now. Not a problem. Okay. People say, why are you going on about this horror? Again, I don't want to be the one. Oh, what do we got here? Well, the older ones were really just old drag queens. They're cross-dressing perverts who want to, use this as an excuse to get into the ladies' locker room and all these bathrooms. They're frauds, in other words. Like I said, what I've observed, when it's like the male to female types are almost all predators. There's a few people who are, traumatized and they're trying to, but the vast majority, they're predators. They're looking for fresh prey and they're using this as an excuse to walk on in. Female to male, it's almost all trauma related. They're trying to escape the gender and the trauma they felt. Like Indy. She's trying to regress back to a point before she got assaulted. Now, I also say there's something in her happened when she was real little that set this thing in motion, but that's what really kicked it off. And what happened to her at 14. I won't go into that. She's gone to herself, in her own videos. But again, I don't want to be, I refuse to be, just write her off. She's not worth it. No, we're all worth it or nobody's worth it. Okay. Someone's got to stand up and say, no, this is a, talented person, intelligent person. It's like, no, you don't get her. This is my line of the sand. Okay. I can't go out and go on rallies or, testify in front of, legislatures because of, like, I'm not sure with this, but I can do this. Because one thing I've noted is so many of these detransitioners that I've gotten to know personally on the various levels. One thing they almost all say is they did not have anybody, very few had anybody to toe the line and say, no, this is wrong. They were not this. The closest really was Chloe Cole. Her parents but they were browbeaten because the expert said so. They tried to say, no, she's not. No, you're and they flashing the degree. I'm the doctor. I know better. But that's a lot of them. They just, use their position to browbeat any parents that might be questioning. No, you got to do it. Would you rather, the common line, would you rather have with a girl, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? Doesn't matter if this kid has ever expressed any interest in offering themselves. They present that, they'll eventually, they'll inevitably, they'll try and kill themselves. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, that's another thing. A lot of the detransition is so. No, I think it's a lot higher than you would think. But one, this should be telling the fact that the industry, refuses to track any detransitioners. So very few come forward. But those that do, I mean, Prisha and Chloe and others, they get such horrible abuse. You'll never try. You'll just kill yourself. It's like, well, to these people, fuck you. You should not be in polite society. But yeah, they need somebody has to provide a lifeline back to reality. No, you're not. Something else is going on here. Now, can we sit down and talk about this? And try and figure out what is really going on, because we know this ain't it. Nobody's born in the wrong body. There's no such thing as even when Indy and I were still talking and arguing. And then she'd lay out the rationale of how this and all, and that's not the way a male brain thinks. You think you're going to male brain? No, you don't. Trust me, I've got one with about twice as many miles as yours has. That's not the way a male brain thinks. Being one and knowing a lot of them, we don't think that way. We're very simplistic creatures. We're not good at multitasking. Okay. And there's a reason for it. We need to be able to focus on something to exclusion of everything else. Okay. See mammoth, kill mammoth. Take screw what's going on over there, and you got to focus on this guy. Or females have to arrange things back at the cave, make sure everything's done, keep track of about 6 different things. Kids going around, fire, food, we lose it. We're not going to keep track of 2 or 3 things. So it's part of our evolutionary backup. It's what we're wired. And all things. Well, about heard things about what about this study? Yeah, nobody is a textbook. We've all got little things that this, but I think it's more like, well, this particular feature in your brain, that's more prominent in this sect, but in general, though, no. Because also, it's like, they keep going, well, intersex people are still one gender or the other. Things may not work right. Things may be a bit deformed, but it's still definitively one or the other. And then very rarely mix them up, So it's all a bunch of half truths, that they're hanging this shit on. And Indy shot back. I'm never a tomboy. I think what maybe you wanted to be a tomboy, but somehow felt you couldn't, Indy. And I've said it before. It's like all you've accomplished now is becoming a tomboy. Because again, I'm a femboy. No, femboys are biological males. Okay. Think Dylan Mulvaney. That's a femboy. An ugly one, but he's a fem. That's a femboy. You're not a femboy because you're not a boy. But again, we're starting to get off in the weeds here. Again, first link on the description right now is that evidence-based therapy center in Seattle. It's not quite within walking distance, Indy, but it's a short drive. It's over by the art museum, and I'm pretty sure they take insurance. So, and again, I will stick a link to that article, that column, a little later, but we'll talk at you later. I get this thing to work.
A sound soul dwells within a sound mind and a sound body.